welcome to everybody here at Carondelet, the cradle of the Sisters of St. Joseph in the United States, and to all of you out in Facebook land and Federation folks, whenever you might see this. Tonight we're gathered to get a new and different look at Mother Delphine Fontbonne, who I am calling missionary and medic. Delphine is somebody who I think has often gotten kind of short shrift in our traditional histories. But tonight, I think as we get to know her, we'll see that she's one of the more adventurous and accomplished of our foundresses, although, gotta say, there were no flies on any of them. You can't start this story without starting in Le Puy. The women of the dream, they lived in a hospital, which meant it was a place of hospitality for the poor, the sick, the orphans, most of those kinds of folks that were mentioned by Jesus when he was separating sheep and goats. Over the years, they changed from wearing the simple peasant dress to a habit. They got an established place in an established church. Here we have, of course, Mother St. John Fontbonne, who was born in 1759, entered the Sisters of St. Joseph at the age of 19, and just a few years later became the superior of her convent at Monistrol, and was there comfortably living exactly the life she expected to live as a Sister of St. Joseph for about 14 years. And then came the French Revolution. She lost the convent, went home to Monistrol, and we don't know what she was doing for about 16 years. Home with her family, probably living, serving the dear neighbor as a Sister of St. Joseph, but not really as a Sister of St. Joseph. She wasn't in a convent, she didn't have a community. Until 1808, when by some weird circumstances, she was called to Saint Etienne to gather together a group of sisters and help them become Sisters of St. Joseph. And that began the whole process of reorganizing Sisters of St. Joseph. And some of this was happening under the influence of Napoleon and his laws. But they were living the life of a convent just like they always had, except for the small fact that they were no longer something like 147 separate foundations, but were becoming large congregations with one superior general and one novitiate. And as Mother St. John Fontbonne continued on, by the time she sent sisters to the United States, she had received 700 women in the community. That's between 1804 and 1836. Now, some of those, of course, were whole communities that joined with the Sisters of Lyon. But that's the kind of thing Delphine Fontbonne saw going on with her aunt in Lyon. So now we get to our friend Sister Marie Delphine Fontbonne, born on Christmas Eve, 1813, baptized Marie Antoinette. Now, does that tell us something about the family's political leanings? When she entered the community of her aunt, there's no reason to think that she had any expectation to do anything except be a Sister of St. Joseph of Lyon and probably in Lyon. Perhaps 10 or 15 miles away, but nothing more than that. So she professed vows as a Sister of St. Joseph on January 3rd, 1835, and this is her vow formula and signature. And here is the register of those received into the novitiate at Lyon between 1819 and 1828. And over here, we have Mother St. John Fontbonne's signature. Now, I said 700. What on earth was bringing so many people into community? First, it was the aftermath of the French Revolution. So, in a time of great confusion, let's look for a way to try to make things right. Being a sister was an opportunity for women to be of real service. This congregation had a fine reputation, as of course did Mother St. John Fontbonne. And there would have been the support of a lot of the clergy. There was also just the religious tradition of France. Has a strong woman influence. If we have the patron saint of Joan of Arc, the one who could, the peasant who saved a king. Mother St. John Fontbonne's good friend, younger than she, St. John Vianney. In 1832, wasn't the first, but in 1832, so just a few years before Delphine, just about the time she was deciding to enter the congregation, there was a cholera epidemic in Lyon and also in Paris. So they would have seen the sick, the dead, the dying. Lyon was also a center of silk workers. And one of the ways the sisters made a living was by making silk ribbons. It was also the scene of what Marx and Engels called one of the first strikes by the common people. The silk workers went on strike a few times in Lyon. So all of this is stuff happening around her. Also happening in Lyon at this time, well, there's a wealthy woman, a rather young, twice widowed, Félicité de Rochacalin, a good friend. She's an admirer of Mother St. John Fontbonne, many years her junior, but an admirer, and has brought Sisters of St. Joseph to various places. The Countess is on fire with this new thing called the Society for the Propagation of the Faith. The missions. Everybody wants to go to the missions. And the Society for the Propagation of the Faith started in Lyon around 1820. So they published their annals. I always say it's the Mary Noel magazine of the 1830s. And they had the stories of the missionaries. I think I skipped something here. Okay, no. So that's in the background. And here we have Delphine Fontbonne. She volunteers for the missions. When they were accepted to come to the Diocese of St. Louis, the community was to meet and decide who among the multitude of volunteers were going to be the chosen ones. And the story is that Mother St. John Fontbonne absented herself from the council meeting who decided, so that she wouldn't have undue influence. And Delphine was one of the chosen. She was 23 years old and had made vows on January 3rd, 1835, 1 year to the day before the sisters left. January 3rd was at that time celebrated as the Feast of St. Joseph in France. I think it was March 19th in America, and that caused some confusion or contention at some times. But, so 23 years old when she made vows. She was 23 years old when she came to the United States. Her sister Febroni Fontbonne is this one, was 9 years her senior. And Febroni had entered the congregation not at 19 like Delphine, but at 14. So she had considerable experience as a Sister of St. Joseph at that time, and she had also been novice director. Her friend, Sister Febroni Chapillon, was 26 years old and had made vows also in June of 1835. The oldest of the group was Sister Marguerite Boutet, who added the name Félicité to her religious name in honor of the Countess. And she was 32. Sister St. Protes was considerably younger than she looks here. She was 21. And she had received the habit 3 months before the sisters left for the United States, for America. Sister Philomene Villain, the only one for whom we have no picture. She received the habit the day they left, on January 3rd, 1836. 2 came a year later. Sister Celestine Pomerel, who was also 23 years old. She had been received in 1831. So she had 6 years of experience in the community before she came to America. And her cousin and dear friend, Mother St. John Fournier, also 23. That was the right number. 3 out of the 8 were 23. St. John Fournier had been a member of another congregation, a cloistered congregation, and somehow the rumor mill got around that the Countess was sending missionaries to America, and so she arranged to transfer from the community to the Sisters of St. Joseph. She came to the Sisters of St. Joseph in June of 1836, received the habit 8 days later, but did not make vows until 1838. So these sisters got on a boat. To get to the boat, they traveled 400 miles by land from Lyon to Le Havre. Then they were 49 days on board from Le Havre to New Orleans. And then they went 400 miles up the Mississippi from New Orleans to St. Louis in the company of Bishop Rosati and Father John Timon. What was their idea of being missionaries? Now, France had a long tradition of missionaries. Remember the North American martyrs, Isaac Jogues? Also, in that whole tradition, we have the Holy Kateri Tekakwitha. So we not only have martyr saints who were missionaries, but we have saints who were indigenous people. Closer to their own time was Philippine Duchesne, who came to St. Louis from France in 1818. She was a religious of the Sacred Heart, and interestingly, the Countess had a cousin in that community in St. Louis. But the Countess still wanted to send Sisters of St. Joseph. She wasn't spending all her money to support the RSCJs. I hope they're not watching. She wanted to send Sisters of St. Joseph. Our sisters surely knew her. They studied English with the religious of the Sacred Heart. Philippine Duchesne says we cultivate, now think of this, a missionary from France to America, to St. Louis, was in St. Charles, was in Flores, and ends up for a while with Native Americans in Kansas and says, we cultivate a very small field for Christ. But we love it, knowing that God does not require great achievements, but a heart that holds nothing back for self. So what were our sisters expecting? Well, from the annals of the Society for the Propagation of the Faith, they have this drawing from Father de Smet telling you what a Kansas village looks like. Pretty clearly, this is a Kansas village of Native Americans. De Smet says in one of his articles, one of his multitude of articles for mission promotion, this country will perhaps one day be the cradle of a new people. Sounds right. City on the hill? Wait. Composed of the ancient savage races, and that class of adventurers, fugitives, and exiles that society has cast forth from its bosom, a heterogeneous and dangerous population which the American Union has collected like a portentous cloud. I don't think he was sold on the frontier people, at least not the Anglos among them. When he talked about the Native Americans, he was less disparaging. In fact, he was one of those who was advocating for better treatment for them. He talks about that portentous cloud of people transporting entire tribes of Indians from the banks of the Mississippi, where they were born, into the solitudes of the West, which are assigned as their place of exile. When he talks about the indigenous people, their religious beliefs. Now he's talking here about the Flatheads, among whom he worked for many years. They believe in a supreme being, the source of every good, alone adorable. They are, the Flatheads, a Pacific people, under chiefs who have merited this title by their experience and their exploits. The chief, here's an idea for learning about authority. The chief does not command, but seeks to persuade. No tribute is paid to him, but it is one of the appendages of his dignity to contribute more than any other to the public expenses. He is generally one of the poorest of the village in consequence of giving away his goods for the relief of his indigent brethren or for the general interests. Although his power has nothing imperious, his authority is nonetheless absolute. It may be said without exaggeration that his wishes are complied with as soon as possible. Now here's something superiors would like. I know not of any government where so much personal liberty is united with greater subordination and devotion. Detraction is a vice unknown. Falsehood is particularly odious. You will perhaps ask, are those the people whom civilized men call barbarians? We have too long erroneously been accustomed to judge the savages by the Indians on the frontier who have learned the vices of the whites. So they've got images of missionaries who were advocates for the people. Then, this is I just show this because I got this next story from this, which is the first English edition of the Annals of the Society for the Propagation of the Faith. And here we have a Frenchman, a missionary contemporaneous with our sisters, Reverend Benjamin Petit. Now, when we understand him, we get a little bit of a sense of the spirituality, the ideas, what was on the inside. He was from Western France, met the Bishop of Vincennes, Indiana, in France, got turned on to the idea of becoming a priest, studied first in Paris, and then came to the United States. He was going to be studying more in the seminary, but a priest out in rural Indiana died with nobody there to care for him, and the nearest priest, about 50 miles away, was too sick to do any traveling. So the bishop said, we need priests more than we need seminarians, and he ordained him. So Father Benjamin, after this rather surprisingly quick ordination, wrote home. And this gives us just some of the ways folks were thinking. He says, I am a priest now. The hand that is writing to you has this day borne Jesus Christ. My hand is consecrated to God. My voice now has a power which God himself obeys. So here we've got, remember that sense of the sacramental power. This is going to be what is in the back of our sisters' minds as they think about priests, even obnoxious as Jacques Fontbonne might have been. And then he says, how my voice trembled this morning at my first Mass. No time to mess around. In 2 days hence, I shall set out alone to a distance of 300 miles to confer the sacraments and impart graces among a people with whom I am unacquainted. I tremble at the sight of my nothingness. So he gets among the Potawatomi people. And he admires them and becomes their advocate. We have made the most urgent solicitations and they have produced no effect in the mind of the president. My poor Indians have but one chance. The American government took possession of the house where we lodged and of the church where they assembled for prayer. It is I who have to dry their tears while they are on the way to exile. I shall have to level the ground, the altar and the church, bury the cross, that those sacred objects may not be subject to profanation. My dear church was stripped. I wept. My hearers wept too. I shall accompany them, at least as far as the mission of the Jesuits, which was in Kansas. This is from Indiana. So he came in 1837 to the United States and accompanied his Indians, protested their removal, did the entire march with them, and became so ill that he died shortly after they arrived in Kansas. He returned to St. Louis and actually died in the house of the Jesuits here in the city. And so you know that our sisters knew that. They knew of him. They knew that this was all just part of the world they lived in. One of their countrymen. How did they put these worlds together? Over there on the right, we have the Cathedral of Leon. It dates back to the 5th and 6th centuries, although it had to be rebuilt in 1180 and again in around 1476. The Cathedral of St. Louis was completed in 1834 with money from the propagation of the faith in Lyon. Probably what they most had in common was that they were both on a river. When Mother St. John Fontbonne went to find a place in Lyon, she went to the hill called La Croix-Rousse. It was called that after the Reformation because that was the hill on which there were at least 13 religious congregations with their mother houses there. So it was the hill that prayed. After the French Revolution, the monastery that was here was no longer functioning, and she built on the land right next to it. And that's the mother house that Mother St. John Fontbonne built in Lyon. So they sort of received the land in heritage from the hill that prays, or the holy hill, and they came to a bluff and got a log cabin that had been built in 1833 for the Sisters of Charity. It was quite a difference, Quite a difference. And soon after they arrived, they split up. 3 sisters were missioned to Cahokia, the 2 Fabronis, Fontbonne and Chapillon, and the novice, Sister St. Protes. That was a pretty nice place as frontier things went. The people spoke French. The priest had been begging for them to come. The only trouble was, within a couple months of the time they got there, he died of river-borne disease. And the 3 sisters were so sick with the same disease that they couldn't even attend his funeral. Meanwhile, over in St. Louis, before they got to the log cabin, the 3 sisters were studying English with the religious of the Sacred Heart in St. Louis. And so there we had Delphine, Sister Felicite, and her name just flew right, Philomene. Now, remember, Delphine was 23, but she was named superior. Now, why? One would guess probably because of her last name, because she was a Fontbonne. On the trip over, Fabroni Fontbonne, 10 or more years of religious life, more than 10 years of religious life, experienced, had been a novice director. Understandable that she would be the superior. But Delphine, barely a year in vows, is named superior, with one sister who's 9 years older than she is, and a novice. Did Bishop Rosati do it because of the name? He named her. Was it that Father Jacques Fontbonne, the brother, had promised to help? We don't know. But it wasn't easy times. Now, this is not a picture from those days. But it does show us where Carondelet and Cahokia are. You know, those of us who travel by car, instead of finding somebody to row us across, it's considerably longer, but they're not that distant if you can find somebody who will row you across. That's where they were. And I call the hardest years, probably, 1836 to 1839. Particularly on this Carondelet, St. Louis side of the river. First of all, there's the question of language. When you don't know the language, you feel like you're 2 years old. And it's awful to be in a 20-some-year-old body and feel like you're 2. All of these things come together into total culture shock. They dreamed of being with the Indians, and here they are in this smelly city. When I say smelly, I'm meaning they started out down there by the old cathedral, where all the riverboats were coming in, where all kinds of things were being loaded and unloaded. They learn the language. They're dealing with a culture, and I'm going to go more into this in the next presentation, but the United States is like nothing they could have imagined. The ideals of democracy in the French mind were the French Revolution that had destroyed the church, that had sent Mother St. John nearly to the guillotine, that had done all of those awful things. And here everybody's saying, we're democratic, this is great. They're all inexperienced. But Delphine in particular is being called on to lead a group when she doesn't know what the heck is going on. And they're dealing with missionary clergy. Now, those of us who've been in the missions may know how some missionaries become little princes, at least. The priest across the street was, I think, kind of a tough old bird. A good man, but he and Mother Delphine did not get on very well. And I think what really happened with her was there's this whole question, in the midst of this, who are we now? Who am I when I don't have any of my old props? The only thing I can rely on is that rule. It tells me when to get up. It tells me what to do. It tells me exactly how we should do things. And so that gives me some security. And if you don't have anything else to hang on to, that's going to be something that you can grab at. So identity was up for grabs, but you know what? She made it. In 1839, she resigned as superior, saying, "It is impossible to discharge the duties which that office imposes and to satisfy the sisters." So the bishop named Mother Celestine Pomerel as the new superior. Same age, a little more experience in religious life. And you know, Mother Celestine and her friend, probably cousin, St. John Fournier, before they came to America, had gone to study deaf education. And the priest who started the modern methods of deaf education was Parisian. And he said that he stayed among the deaf and tried to understand their spontaneous modes of communication with one another. And then he sort of codified that and built it on French grammar and started the whole business of sign language, which became the way of teaching the deaf that our sisters brought to America. So what they had done in studying deaf education was step completely out of their normal way of doing things. Didn't matter a bit what their mouths said or what their ears heard. They had to figure out how to watch hands and use them to communicate. So it was a step that helped prepare them for a step into a new culture. So back to Mother Delphine. A summary of her early years. After she left being superior, she went across the river to Cahokia and was in that school where her sister, Febroni, was the superior. And she taught French and studied English. English is not an easy language, and who knows what kind of natural gifts these sisters had for learning. But she went there and was with her sister, which must have been a comfort. 1844 to 45, she came back to Carondelet and was a French teacher, ended up teaching some of the sisters who would be great foundresses in the future. 1845 to 1850, she and a novice and another sister, the novice named Martha von Bunning, are at St. Vincent de Paul Grade School, the first parish grade school that was established and continued to go in the city of St. Louis. And in 1850, she's called to Philadelphia to work at the orphanage and the novitiate, because Mother St. John Fournier, who is in Philadelphia, is absolutely worn out. And so Delphine and Martha von Bunning go to work there. 1851, she goes up to Toronto. But before we really get into the Toronto days, let's just take a look at what's happened in these years. We went through the 36 to 39. The first woman received into the community received the habit in 1840. She died in 1842. Now, what does that do to a community? In 1843, Bishop Rosati died, not here, but in Rome, after he had done a mission to Haiti. And they hear that this Irish guy as we say in FBI, a foreign-born Irish, Kenrick, has been named, but he wasn't even here when he was supposed to be coadjutor to Bishop Rosati, but Rosati up and died on him. So he comes in and takes over a diocese in huge debt. Now Rosati's got a good financial head, so he's not gonna be giving away a lot of money to the sisters, but he is going to be a great support. 1845-46, the Sisters of St. Joseph, at the behest of the bishop and Father Paris, open a school for colored children, they say, children of free blacks, and teach slaves on the weekends. And within a year, it's shut down by rioting protesters. 1845, the Sisters of Charity affiliate with the Daughters of Charity in France, and so they can't any longer take care of boy children. And the Sisters of St. Joseph take over their orphanage here in St. Louis, which eventually becomes the home for boys that our sisters had for so many years. 1848, another one of their first vocations dies. May of 1847, 4 sisters from Carondelet, led by Mother St. John Fournier, found a mission in Philadelphia. And so now we've got sort of 2 major superiors. The cousins and women well prepared to teach the deaf are the major superiors in the U.S. Celestine Pomerel and St. John Fournier. They, right away in Philadelphia, within a couple months of the time that they arrive, the bishop says, I've got some vocations for you. They're trying to take care of an orphanage. They're trying to get their feet on the ground. People are not sure that they're really going to welcome them, and now they've got women to feed as well and train. I love this picture. This is one of those, a recent discovery. This is Celestine and St. John Fournier in their younger years. Our sisters weren't afraid of friendships in those days, you know? They were the 2 who were sort of directing the growth and development of Sisters of St. Joseph in the U.S. And Delphine and her friend, how many years? 11 years, her junior, Martha von Bunning, have gone to Philadelphia. And then the Bishop of Toronto hears that there's a Fontbonne in town. His father had supported Mother St. John Fontbonne long before the Revolution in the Monistrol days. And he sort of called in his chips and said, I'd like her to come and found in Canada. And so these 2 and 2 sisters from Philadelphia. So this is a joint foundation. Carondelet and Philadelphia start Toronto. And just quickly, the bishops who played a part. Peter Richard Kenrick, 3rd Archbishop in the United States. Archbishop before his elder brother, Francis Patrick, who was Bishop of Philadelphia. You wonder why we went there. Armand Charbonnel, who was the Bishop of Toronto. And Joseph Cretin, who was the Bishop of St. Paul, where we also went in 1851. They founded this mission jointly, went on October 7th, 1851. Mother Delphine Fontbonne and Sisters Martha von Bunning, Alphonsus Marjoram, and Bernard Dinan. As time would go on, those sisters would be in Canada, in different, Martha von Bunning would open a house in Hamilton and eventually become the first Superior General of Hamilton, and a lot more story there. At one point, she's back in Erie. Bernard Dinan helps out in Buffalo. They knew no boundaries. In Toronto, they arrive in 1851. Their mission, care for the orphans, the sick, the poor, the vulnerable. In 1852, they start a mission in Hamilton, St. Patrick's School. In 1854, they really establish their mother house and open an academy. How were they living? They were very poor. Mother Bernard Dinan's biography in the Dictionary of Canadian Biography says, they lived there in great poverty with their charges, the orphans. The sisters supported themselves by begging in the streets and doing laundry and other menial chores. So here they made bags for gunshot or powder. There they took in laundry. One of the men who was there the day that they got there, this kind of gives us a little sense of Delphine. On October 7th, 1851, I had the honor of welcoming Reverend Mother Delphine and her 3 companions. What a lively time there was in that little orphan asylum that first afternoon of the sisters' arrival. Hardly had they placed their bonnets and shawls in the front room when the superior was inspecting, arranging, ordering from dormitory to cellar. It was not long before a complete transformation was effected, and one of the front rooms turned into a most inviting chapel. Yeah, well, I won't swear that those are the Canadian orphans, but they're orphans. So, Sister Alphonsus, one of the youngest who went with them, is within a year in charge of a school named St. Alphonsus. You've got to feel a little ownership and responsibility when that happens, no? They take on another school, St. Patrick's School. Now, for those of us in the U.S., this is a kind of interesting thing. These are separate schools. According to the Canadian practice, when there is a significant minority and who want for public schooling, that minority can select their own, basically, school board, and that school board hires the teachers and arranges for the schooling. So the sisters were teaching full salaried in public schools, but they were separate schools, tax funded, and that whole system was organized pretty much between the 1830s until it was enshrined in the 1867 Canadian Constitution. This is why the financial situation of sisters in Canada is significantly different from the typical sisters in the United States. So what are these sisters doing? Opening schools, separate schools where they do, thank heavens, indeed receive a salary. They're also tending the immigrant. This is a picture of the Toronto shoreline at that time. Between 1830 and 1850, approximately 624,000 Irish immigrants arrived in Canada, the majority to Ontario and its capital city, Toronto. Why? English is what you're speaking there. In 1840, when the potato famine hit, books will tell us that half of the Irish population was subsisting on potatoes. So when that crop went, everything went. And they did whatever they could to get out, to survive somehow. So what did they do? They begged, bartered, did anything they could to get passage on a ship that were called coffin ships. Breeding grounds for typhus. People jammed in. These little, as I read one of the descriptions, these are the places for a family. What we might call an uncomfortable small bunk. So these are the people that this French-bred missionary is now trying to care for. And they're going to have quite a different accent from the people she learned English from in St. Louis. So, Mother Delphine Fontbonne, curriculum vitae. Born Marie Antoinette. She's a missionary, she's a teacher. She's been a director of novice, she's done childcare with orphans and with deaf children. She's been an administrator, a religious superior, was a founder at Carondelet and Toronto. She's a sister of St. Joseph. And most unexpectedly, she was a nurse. What we have here is something that the Toronto Archives has preserved beautifully. It is, in French it would be literally translated as a recipe book. It's a book of home remedies for caring for the sick. And if we take a little closer look, the inscription says, "For the use of Sister Marie Delphine, born Fontbonne, given by our Reverend Mother in September of 1835, as a remembrance." Mother St. John sent her with a medical book. And here we have Delphine's signature. This is the second page of that book, and it's the weights and measures. And then you go on, and it's full of things that, the very end of the book has notations and remedies, recipes for remedies in English, but it started out in French. So what happened? Mother St. John Fontbonne's signature. There was a typhus epidemic, easy to understand with what's happening with the immigrants. A typhus epidemic in Toronto in 1855. And Delphine now is a medic. She serves the people, cares for them. And this is kind of a picture of what happens for the folks going from the happy home to the place where everyone is destitute. The father has died, the mother is dying, and the end of her life, her necrology tells us, Mother Delphine, she was untiring in her ministrations to the sick and dying. She finally contracted the disease after spending the night with a wretched woman in the poorer quarters of the city. In spite of her hitherto robust constitution and the untiring attentions of her daughters, 19 years and 11 months after arriving in America, she breathed her last shortly after noon on February 7th, 1856. Not quite 20 years in America. And so there we have Mother Delphine Fontbonne, missionary and medic. Now I think we're going to be open for questions and comments. Is that right, Patty?
Anybody have a question?
Or comment?
Did you raise your hand?
Did she learn anything about medicine in France, do we know, or just she taught herself?
In those days, real work in medicine didn't come in until Florence Nightingale later. And in the United States, it was big after the Civil War. But most women some woman in the family generally was supposed to be the one who learned how to work with home remedies and take care of the sick. But it was very much a home kind of situation. Hospitals for the ill were primarily looked at as places for the destitute to die. Mary Ellen.
Mary Ellen?
I'm probably the only one who needs this answered, but I didn't write anything down. And so when you were going through the various sisters and their cousins and their sisters and so forth, Delphine Fontbonne's sister was who?
Fontbonne Fontbonne.
Fontbonne. Okay. Didn't they have a cousin somewhere?
No. In the Fontbonne family, there were 3 generations of sisters who were sisters of St. Joseph. Mother St. John Fontbonne had 2 aunts who were sisters of St. Joseph. Mother St. John and her sister became sisters of St. Joseph. And Fontbonne and Delphine, their nieces, were sisters of St. Joseph.
Fontbonne and Delphine were sisters.
They were sisters, 9 years apart.
Which one came back to France?
Fontbonne came back to France. And see, that's where I say Delphine really got her feet on the ground. She may have gotten, in some stories, a bad rap, but she's the one who stuck it out. Claire?
Is there any chance we could get that remedy book translated and start using it? Are they still applicable?
One of the real challenges is figuring out what the herbs were called in 1830 in French and get that into English. But actually, I have sent the recipe book to one of our sisters who's very good in French, and I don't know what she's done with it yet. I've sent a PDF of it. I haven't sent the original.
Just because it always comes to, why all the orphans? It just seems like in our early, literally.
Disease.
Mothers die.
Mothers die. Lots of women die in childbirth. Yeah. And just a personal anecdote, in the year 2000, I said to my parents who had lived through most of that century, what's the biggest change that happened? And my father, the physician, said, antibiotics. He said we wouldn't have the population that we have today. There would not be overpopulation in the world anywhere if it weren't for antibiotics. Our 2 young sisters, yeah, right, our 2 first deaths would not have died. Stuff that's very simple today. In the Civil War, most of the deaths of soldiers were from infection, not from death on the battlefield.
And probably improvement in water supply.
Yes. So that everybody hears you.
And probably improvement in the water supply, sanitary conditions. And I think early on in the cities, there was overcrowding. Food that wasn't necessarily all that good.
Well, in that picture that I showed with the typhus in France, they showed the Grim Reaper right there at the city pump, Any other comments, questions? Do you wish you had been there with her? Well, thank you all very much. We have a nice reception here. And thank you to everybody out there in Facebook and Federation Land.